He once built ships with his bare hands, but now he couldn't even open a pickle jar. This is the story of Arthur, a man who was told his strength was gone forever, but refused to believe it. He turned away from the sterile advice of modern medicine and discovered a powerful, ancient secret to rebuilding not just his body, but his very identity. It's a story of hope, dignity, and finding strength in the most unexpected places. If you're ready for an inspiring journey, please take a moment to hit that like button and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin. The ghost of the man he used to be lived in his workshop. Dean Pendleton could feel him in the cool, salt-tinged air, a silent observer in a room where time had seemingly stood still. The scent of cedar shavings and old varnish hung heavy, a perfume that had once meant purpose and strength. Now, it only served as a reminder of the quiet betrayal of his own body. His eyes, the color of a faded sea chart, scanned the neat rows of tools hanging on the pegboard wall. Each one had a story. The well-worn chisels, their wooden handles stained dark with the sweat of 1,000 projects. The hand planes, their steel blades still honed to a razor's edge. They were extensions of his hands, instruments with which he had once tamed stubborn oak and pine, coaxing them into the elegant, sweeping lines of a ship's hull. His gaze settled on the mallet. It wasn't the largest, but it was his favorite. The head was made of lignum vitae, a wood so dense it sinks in water, and the handle was a smooth, familiar piece of ash. For 50 years, the solid, satisfying thump of that mallet striking a chisel had been the rhythm of his life. It was the sound of creation, of control. Slowly, he reached for it. His fingers, once impossibly strong, now felt like a collection of stiff, aching twigs. They wrapped around the handle, but there was no certainty in the grip. He tried to lift it from its hook. His mind knew the weight, remembered the effortless swing, but the signal seemed to get lost on its way to his muscles. A tremor ran up his forearm. The mallet, his old friend, felt impossibly heavy, an anchor chaining him to this new, weaker reality. With a soft clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room, it slipped from his grasp and fell to the concrete floor. Dean stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. It was just a tool on the floor, but in that moment, it was his entire life, lying there just beyond his reach. He was Dean Pendleton, the man who had built boats sturdy enough to laugh at a nor'easter, the man whose handshake was his bond. Now, he was the man who couldn't even lift his own mallet. The sting of failure pushed him out of the workshop and back into the house. He needed a distraction, something to do. Groceries. The mundane task felt like a mountain to climb. He'd driven to the market in Port Blossom, the small New England town that had been his home since birth. He'd navigated the aisles, leaning heavily on the shopping cart like it was a walker, each item he placed inside a small victory. Now, the 2 paper bags sat on the passenger seat of his old truck, taunting him. He managed the first one, his arms shaking with the strain as he set it on the kitchen counter. He went back for the second. It was heavier. A carton of milk, a bag of potatoes. He gripped the top of the bag, the paper crinkling under the pressure of his unsteady fingers. He took the 3 steps from the driveway to his porch. On the 3rd step, his knee, a traitor he'd been arguing with for years, decided to buckle without warning. It wasn't a dramatic, painful collapse. It was a slow, humiliating surrender. His grip on the bag loosened. An apple, round and red, escaped and rolled across the weathered porch boards. Then a can of soup broke through the bottom of the wet paper, hitting the wood with a dull thud before rolling to a stop next to the apple. Dean found himself on one knee, the scattered groceries like evidence of his own incompetence. He wasn't hurt. Not really. Only his pride was bleeding, a wound deeper and more painful than any scrape or bruise. He was still kneeling there, staring at the runaway apple, when another truck pulled into the driveway. David, his son. Arthur's heart sank. David got out, his movements crisp and efficient. He was a physical therapist, a man who saw the world in terms of muscle groups, joint mobility, and recovery protocols. He didn't rush to his father's side. He assessed the situation, his face a calm, clinical mask of concern. "Dad, are you okay?" Dean pushed himself up, his face flushed with shame. "I'm fine," he grumbled, brushing dust from his trousers. The bag just tore. David's eyes swept over the scene, the scattered groceries, his father's unsteady posture, the slight tremor in his hands. He didn't see a torn bag. He saw instability. He saw risk. He saw a problem that needed to be managed. "Let me get that," he said, his voice gentle but firm, the voice he used with his patients. He gathered the groceries with an easy strength that felt like a rebuke. Inside, as David put the milk in the refrigerator, the tension between them filled the small kitchen. It was an old, familiar silence, thick with unspoken words. Dean saw a son who looked at him and saw only a collection of symptoms. David saw a father whose stubborn pride was the biggest obstacle to his own well-being. "We need to be more careful, Dad," David said, turning from the fridge. "We can't have this happening." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Nothing happened, David. I just dropped a few things." This time, David replied, and in those two words, Dean heard the future his son envisioned for him, a future of careful steps, of managed decline, of a life shrinking until it was small enough to be safe. It was a future Dean Pendleton refused to accept. Not yet. The fall, minor as it was, became the justification for a full-scale invasion. David, armed with the certainty of his profession, descended upon Arthur's quiet life like a clinical storm. The first casualty was the kitchen. Arthur's countertop, usually cluttered with a worn wooden cutting board, a jar of sea salt, and the day's mail, was wiped clean and reorganized into a sterile landscape of modern wellness. Two large, white plastic tubs now stood where the cookie jar used to be. One was labeled whey protein isolate, vanilla, the other micronized creatine. Next to them sat a rainbow-colored pill organizer, each of its 14 compartments meticulously filled. Monday AM, Monday PM, Tuesday AM, Tuesday PM. Arthur's week was now mapped out in a series of tiny plastic boxes. His diet, once a matter of simple taste and habit, was replaced by a laminated chart taped to the refrigerator. Meals were no longer called breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They were caloric intake windows. The food itself was a monument to joylessness. Breakfast was a chalky protein shake that David blended for him, the whir of the machine, an unwelcome alarm clock. Lunch was a precisely weighed portion of steamed chicken breast and broccoli, with no butter and only a whisper of salt. Flavor, it seemed, was an unnecessary variable in the equation of recovery. Then came the exercises. David would arrive each afternoon, his face set with professional encouragement, and guide Dean through a series of movements that felt profoundly insulting. He had Dean sit in a chair and slowly extend one leg, hold for 3 seconds, and lower it, 10 repetitions. Then the other leg. He had him stand and perform calf raises, his hands resting on the back of a chair for balance. Each movement was slow, deliberate, and excruciatingly dull. "This is rebuilding the foundational strength, Dad," David would explain, his voice patient. "We're reactivating the muscle fibers." But Dean didn't feel like he was rebuilding anything. He felt like he was being dismantled. The man who had hoisted heavy timbers onto a frame was now struggling to lift his own leg. The exercises didn't make him feel stronger. They simply provided a detailed, moment-by-moment report of everything he had lost. His world, once as vast as the open ocean, had shrunk to the space between his armchair and the kitchen table. His autonomy was gone, replaced by his son's well-meaning but suffocating care. One afternoon, desperate for a breath of his old life, Dean made an escape. He told David he was going for a short, prescribed walk. Instead, he drove his truck to the Port Blossom Diner, a place of worn vinyl booths and the comforting aroma of coffee and frying bacon. He slid into his usual booth in the corner and ordered a black coffee, the simple act of choosing for himself feeling like a radical rebellion. He was stirring his coffee when a familiar figure shuffled towards his table. It was Walter Finn, a fellow shipwright from the old days. Walter moved with the slow, careful gait of a man who had made a permanent truce with his own fragility. "Arthur, you old salt," Walter said, easing himself into the opposite side of the booth with a soft groan. "Good to see you out and about." "You too, Walter," Dean said, forcing a smile. Walter launched into what Dean called the organ recital, a detailed account of his various ailments. He spoke of his bad knee, his blood pressure medication, and the new diet his doctor had him on. He talked about it all with a casual, unbothered sense of resignation, as if discussing the weather. "The doc says I've got to cut out the salt," Walter said, eyeing the salt shaker on the table with a look of fond remembrance. "Says my kidneys are working overtime. So, it's unsalted crackers and low-sodium soup for me from now on. Getting old isn't for the faint of heart, eh?" Dean just nodded, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He looked at his friend, a good man who had once been as strong as an ox, now cheerfully cataloguing his own decline. Walter had accepted it. He had surrendered to the world of prescriptions, of limitations, of a life lived according to a doctor's chart. He wasn't fighting it, he was managing it. And in his friend's cheerful resignation, Dean saw the terrifying future that David was meticulously planning for him. He saw a life of bland shakes, of slow, meaningless exercises, of quiet surrender. He left the diner with the taste of bitter coffee in his mouth. The brief escape hadn't comforted him. It had shown him exactly what he was fighting against. He wasn't just fighting against weak muscles. He was fighting against becoming Walter Finn. Days bled into one another, each one a pale copy of the last. Arthur's favorite armchair became his viewing post, the picture window in his living room, a frame for the world that was moving on without him. He watched the tides ebb and flow in the distant harbor, a rhythm that had once set the pace of his life. Now, it was just a clock, marking the slow passage of his confinement. It was from this vantage point that he first saw her. The house next door, empty for years, had quietly been sold. One morning, Dean noticed movement in the overgrown garden. A woman, her silver hair tied back in a simple knot, was kneeling in the dirt, her hands tending to the neglected rose bushes. He guessed she was his age, perhaps older, but she moved with a fluid economy that he found mesmerizing. There was no hesitation in her actions, no wasted energy. She pulled weeds with a firm, steady motion and pruned the thorny branches with a grace that seemed at odds with the sharp tool in her hand. She worked for hours, a portrait of calm purpose. He watched her for the next few days, his curiosity a welcome distraction from his own bleak thoughts. She never seemed to hurry, yet the garden was slowly being transformed, its hidden order and beauty coaxed back to the surface. She moved like she belonged to the earth, her energy drawn from the soil and the sea air. She was a quiet rebuke to his own stiff, resentful body. One afternoon, the gnawing emptiness in his stomach drove him to the kitchen. He would make himself a proper sandwich, a small act of defiance against David's regimen of tasteless shakes. He took a loaf of rye bread from the pantry, sliced a tomato, and pulled a joint of roast beef from the refrigerator. All he needed was a few crisp pickles. The jar sat on the shelf, its metal lid sealed tight. Dean gripped it with his right hand, his palm sweating slightly. He twisted. Nothing. The lid didn't budge. He grunted, a sound of frustration, and switched hands. He wrapped a dish towel around the lid for better grip and twisted again, putting his shoulder into it. A hot, sharp pain shot through his wrist, and the jar remained stubbornly sealed. He glared at the inanimate object as if it were a personal enemy. It was absurd. He had caulked the seams of a 40-foot schooner in a single day, his hands working tirelessly, but he couldn't open a simple jar of pickles. The frustration boiled over into a wave of hot, helpless anger. He was about to slam the jar down on the counter when a soft voice came from the open screen door behind him. Sometimes, a little tap on the edge is all it needs. Dean froze, startled. The woman from next door was standing on his back porch, a small, knowing smile on her face. Her eyes were the color of dark, wet stones, and they held a deep, unnerving calm. He hadn't even heard her approach. "I saw you from my window," she said, her voice gentle. "You looked to be in a fight." Embarrassment washed over him. He felt exposed, his weakness laid bare for a stranger to see. He just mumbled, "It stuck." She stepped inside, wiping her feet carefully on the mat. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the jar. Dean slid it across the counter, feeling like a fool. She didn't try to twist it. Instead, she took the jar, turned it upside down, and gave the edge of the lid a single sharp rap with the heel of her hand. Then she turned it back over, and with a simple, effortless twist, the lid gave way with a soft pop. She handed the open jar back to him. "There you are." Dean stared at her, dumbfounded by the elegant simplicity of the solution. "Thank you," he managed to say. "It is no trouble," she said. Her eyes flickered down to his hands, then back to his face. "Sometimes," she said, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more thoughtful, "the strongest grip comes from the strongest bones." The words hung in the air, full of a meaning he couldn't quite grasp but felt deep inside. It wasn't an accusation or pity, it was a statement of fact, like saying the sky was blue. Before he could ask what she meant, she placed something small and white on the counter next to the jar. It was a seashell, a perfect, pearly white scallop, no bigger than his thumb. "For your windowsill," she said. And with another small smile, she turned and walked out the door as quietly as she had appeared, leaving Dean standing alone in his kitchen with an open jar of pickles, a mysterious piece of wisdom, and the scent of salt and roses in the air. The small, perfect seashell sat on Arthur's windowsill, catching the morning light. It was a constant, silent reminder of the woman next door and her strange, resonant words. "The strongest grip comes from the strongest bones." The phrase echoed in his mind, a piece of a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. His own bones felt brittle, his grip weak. Desperation, he decided, was a stronger force than pride. Later that day, he walked the few yards to her front door and knocked. Evelyn Reed answered, a welcoming smile on her face, as if she had been expecting him. "Arthur," she said, her voice warm, "please come in." Her home was nothing like his. It was simple, uncluttered, and filled with the clean, invigorating scent of ginger and sea salt. There were no protein tubs or pill organizers here. Instead, glass jars filled with dried herbs lined the shelves, and a pot simmered gently on the stove, releasing a fragrant steam. She didn't ask about his health or his fall. She simply offered him a cup of tea and began to talk. She didn't preach, she shared stories. She spoke of the small coastal village in Japan where she grew up, of the fishermen who would spend their days pulling heavy nets from the cold, unforgiving ocean. They were strong men, well into their old age, she said, her dark eyes thoughtful. Their secret was not in what they lifted, but in what they drank. Every morning, their wives would prepare a special broth for them to keep their bones strong against the cold and their muscles from withering. Dean listened, captivated. "Our bodies are like ships, Arthur," she continued, her analogy striking a deep chord within him. "You can have the strongest timber, but without good fasteners and solid framing, the ship will fall apart in the first storm. Protein is the timber, yes, but collagen is the framing. It is the scaffolding that holds everything together." She saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes and stood up. "Let me show you." In her kitchen, she took a bundle wrapped in paper from the refrigerator. Inside were the glistening, silvery skins of several large fish. She explained that she got them from the local fishmonger, who was usually happy to give them away. She placed them in a pot, covered them with water, and added a few thick slices of ginger and a sprinkle of sea salt. "The ocean provides the most wonderful kind," she explained, her hands moving with practiced ease. "Marine collagen. The body drinks it in, absorbs it more easily than any other. It goes right to work, mending the fibers." The process was a simple, beautiful ritual, not a sterile chore. It was nourishment, not just treatment. It was the first time in months that Dean had felt a genuine spark of hope. Dean began his quiet rebellion. The next morning, he visited the fish market down at the pier, a place he hadn't been to in months. The fishmonger, a man named Sal whose father had bought fish from Arthur's father, greeted him with a surprised but happy grin. "Arthur, good to see you on your feet." "Good to be on them, Sal," Dean replied. He felt a pang of embarrassment asking for what was essentially scraps, but he pushed the feeling down. "I need some fish skins, salmon, cod, whatever you have." Sal's eyebrows went up, but he just nodded. "Making a fish head soup. My grandmother swore by it." He wrapped up a generous portion for Dean and refused to take any money for it. "Good for the bones," he said with a wink. Back in his own kitchen, with David not due until the afternoon, Dean started his first batch. The house slowly filled with the clean, savory aroma of the simmering broth. It was the smell of the sea, of life. When it was done, he strained the clear golden liquid into a jar and hid it in the back of the refrigerator behind the carton of orange juice. The act itself felt invigorating. He was taking control, making a choice for himself. David arrived later with his blender and his chart, and Dean drank the chalky vanilla shake without complaint, guarding his secret. The first few days, he felt no different. The quiet disappointment began to creep in. Perhaps David was right. Perhaps this was just foolish folklore. But on the fourth morning, as he swung his legs out of bed, he noticed something. The usual fiery ache in his knees was duller. It was still there, a low ember instead of a flame. Later that day, he stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes and realized he'd been standing for 10 minutes without the urgent need to sit down. It was a small change, a subtle shift in the landscape of his pain. But it was his change. It was a secret victory, a testament to the simmering pot on the stove, and it was enough to make him continue. Evelyn saw the change in him before he even said a word. It was in the way he stood a little straighter, the way he walked across his lawn without his eyes fixed on the ground. "The sea is mending the sails," she said one afternoon as they sat on her porch. "Now we must strengthen the hull." She then introduced her next lesson, and Dean felt a wave of profound revulsion. Chicken feet. She brought one out to show him, pale and clawed. He had seen them in butcher shops, but the thought of cooking them, of eating a broth made from them, turned his stomach. "I know," she said, her eyes twinkling as she read his expression perfectly. "They are not beautiful, but they are powerful." With a patience that soothed his resistance, she explained, "The fish collagen is for repair. It is type 1. It rebuilds the muscle fibers quickly, but the chicken feet, they are from the earth. They are full of type 2 collagen and glucosamine and chondroitin. They do not just repair, they fortify. They rebuild the cartilage in your joints, the very cushions that are wearing away." He was still skeptical, but the memory of his aching knees and the tangible relief he'd already felt from the fish broth made him listen. He trusted the evidence of his own body more than his squeamishness. Reluctantly, he agreed to try. The journey to recovery, he was learning, was not always a scenic one. It required him to move past his own old, stubborn ideas. With a surge of newfound confidence, Dean decided he had earned a reward. A real breakfast. He met Walter at the diner, and feeling like his old self, he ordered the Captain's Special. 2 eggs, 3 strips of crispy bacon, a pile of home-fried potatoes, and white toast with butter. It was delicious, a feast of salt and fat and nostalgia. He felt strong, invigorated. The next morning, he paid the price. He woke up feeling stiff and heavy. The fire in his knees was back with a vengeance, and his fingers were so swollen he could barely make a fist. His progress felt as if it had been completely erased, washed away by a single meal. He was grimacing as he tried to weed a small patch in his garden when Evelyn appeared by the fence. She took one look at his pained expression and knew. "A trip to the diner, I see," she said softly. He looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" "Your body is telling me," she said. She came and sat with him on the porch steps. "The broths are powerful medicine, Arthur. But even the best medicine cannot work if you are also taking poison." Gently, she explained it to him. She didn't scold. She taught. She told him of the 3 poisons that seniors, in their search for comfort, so often embrace. First was the white starch, the potatoes and the toast. She explained how it turns to sugar in the blood almost instantly, causing a spike that creates inflammation throughout the body, blocking the very pathways the collagen needs to do its work. Second was the processed meat, the bacon. She described how the nitrates and chemical preservatives, combined with the high sodium, act as an inflammatory bomb, especially in aging joints. Finally, she mentioned the glass of wine or whiskey many take to relax in the evening. She explained how alcohol, even in small amounts, stops muscle repair in its tracks, turning healing sleep into a wasted opportunity. "You are trying to put out a fire," she concluded, her voice kind. "You cannot do that if you are also throwing oil on the flames." The setback was a bitter but crucial lesson. True strength wasn't just about what you added to your life, it was also about what you had the wisdom to leave behind. The confrontation he had been dreading came on a Tuesday. David arrived earlier than usual, carrying a new tub of chocolate-flavored protein powder. Dean was in the kitchen, carefully straining a fresh batch of chicken feet broth, the thick, gelatinous liquid shimmering in the afternoon light. There was no hiding it. David stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes going from the strange pot on the stove to the jar of broth in his father's hand. "Dad, what is that?" The smell, which Dean now found comforting and savory, was foreign and alarming to his son. "It's broth," Dean said, his voice steady. David stepped closer, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "Broth? What kind of broth? What are you doing? This isn't on the plan." The dam of Arthur's carefully maintained patience finally broke. "No, it isn't on your plan, David. It's on mine." The argument was explosive, a storm that had been gathering for weeks. David saw his father, vulnerable and impressionable, being taken in by the unscientific nonsense of a strange neighbor. He saw danger. He saw a deviation from the proven, peer-reviewed path to wellness. "This is insane," David said, his voice rising. "You don't know what's in this. It could be interacting with your medications. That woman is not a doctor. She's a charlatan feeding you folklore." He pulled out his phone, ready to cite studies on protein synthesis and grams per kilogram of body weight. But Arthur, for the first time, didn't cower or get defensive. He felt a strength that had nothing to do with his muscles. It was the strength of his own experience. "I don't need a study to tell me what I feel, son," Dean said, his voice low but powerful. "For the first time in 2 years, I woke up this morning and I didn't have to think before I put my feet on the floor. I can open my own jars. I can stand for more than 5 minutes. This folklore is working." He looked his son directly in the eye. "I would rather feel alive and risk failure following my own path than feel like a patient in my own home following yours." The words struck David like a physical blow. He stared at his father, seeing not a frail old man, but a stranger full of fire and defiance. The argument ended there, not with an agreement, but with a deep, painful rift. David left, the new tub of protein powder sitting untouched on the counter, a monument to their broken connection. With the storm broken, a strange calm settled over Arthur. He was on his own now, fully and completely, and it was liberating. He dove into the new routine with the same focus and dedication he had once given to building boats. He made the broths, combining the fish skin and chicken feet as Evelyn had suggested, a union of sea and earth. His workshop became his proving ground. The narrative of his recovery was written not in a doctor's chart, but in a series of quiet, monumental victories. One morning, he walked the entire length of the Port Blossom Pier and back again without his cane, the steady rhythm of his steps, a triumphant drumbeat against the old wood. A week later, he spent a full afternoon in his workshop, sanding a long piece of ashwood for a new tool handle. He worked for 3 straight hours, and only when he was finished did he realize that his hands weren't cramping and his back wasn't screaming. He looked at his own hands, steady and capable, as if they were old friends he hadn't seen in years. The biggest shock came when he saw Walter trying to load a heavy box of old fishing gear into his truck. Without thinking, Dean walked over. "Let me get that for you, Walt." Before his friend could protest, Dean bent his knees, gripped the box, and lifted. It was heavy, but his body responded. He felt his legs engage, his core tighten. He lifted it cleanly and settled it into the bed of the truck. He and Walter stood there for a moment in stunned silence. "Well, I'll be," Walter finally breathed out. "Arthur, what in the world have you been doing?" Dean just smiled. He wasn't building boats anymore. He was building himself anew, piece by piece, from the inside out. And Evelyn would watch him from her garden, a quiet, knowing smile on her face, seeing the ship she had helped him launch finally find its strength. David couldn't stay away completely. His anger was tangled with a deep, persistent worry. He started driving by his father's house, telling himself he was just checking to make sure everything was all right. From the safety of his truck, he watched, and what he saw began to dismantle his certainty. He saw his father carrying a bag of soil from the garage to the garden, walking with a purpose he hadn't seen in years. He saw him climbing a small stepladder to clean his gutters, moving with a balance and confidence that seemed impossible. The transformation was undeniable. It defied the charts, the studies, and everything David thought he knew about geriatric rehabilitation. His scientific mind, initially so dismissive, was now consumed by a relentless, professional curiosity. That night, he didn't look at physical therapy journals. He opened his laptop and typed in a new set of keywords: marine collagen muscle synthesis, glucosamine chondroitin joint inflammation, advanced glycation end products, processed meat. He fell down a rabbit hole of research, his eyes widening as he read. He found studies from Japan, from South Korea, from leading American universities, all of them validating the core principles of what Evelyn had been teaching. He read about the superior bioavailability of marine collagen, about the synergistic effects of type 1 and type 2 for rebuilding both muscle and cartilage. He read about how high glycemic foods create systemic inflammation, effectively short-circuiting protein absorption. It was all there, written in the cold, objective language of science he trusted. This wasn't folklore, it was biochemistry. A profound sense of shame washed over him. He hadn't been wrong to care, but he had been profoundly wrong in his certainty. He had been so focused on his own knowledge that he had refused to see the truth right in front of him. He hadn't been treating his father. He had been managing a set of symptoms, and in the process, he had missed the man entirely. The next time David visited, he didn't bring protein powder. He brought a simple notebook and a pen. Dean saw him coming up the walk and braced himself for another argument, but was met with a look he hadn't seen on his son's face in years: humility. "Dad," David began, his voice quiet and awkward. "Can we talk?" They sat at the kitchen table, the place where they had argued so fiercely. This time, there was no anger. David opened his notebook. "Tell me about the broths," he said. "Tell me everything." It was the most honest conversation they had ever had. Dean spoke of his despair, of Evelyn's wisdom, and of how it felt to feel his own body coming back to life. David listened. He didn't interrupt or correct, he just listened, taking notes, asking genuine questions. "I was wrong," David said finally, the words heavy with sincerity. "I found the research. I should have. I'm sorry, Dad. Not just for being wrong, for not listening to you." In that moment, the rift between them began to heal. They found a new common ground, a place where David's clinical knowledge of physiology could meet Arthur's experiential wisdom. They talked about timing the broths for maximum absorption, about gentle exercises that would complement the nutritional healing. As a first step, a gesture of their new partnership, they walked together over to Walter's house. Walter was on his porch, complaining about his bad knee. Dean just smiled, and for the first time, David didn't see a patient. He saw a man helping his friend, and he knew exactly what to say to help them both. 6 months later, the workshop was once again Arthur's sanctuary. But it was no longer a place of ghosts. It was alive with the scent of fresh cedar shavings and the sound of a sharp blade slicing through wood. He was putting the finishing touches on a small, exquisitely crafted model of a sailboat, its lines as graceful as a seabird's wing. It was a gift for Evelyn. He moved with a quiet, purposeful ease, his hands steady, his body a willing and able partner to his craft. The workshop door creaked open and David came in, carrying not a blender, but a steaming thermos. He poured 2 mugs of the rich golden broth they had prepared together that morning. "It's looking beautiful, Dad," David said, admiring the boat. "She's got good bones," Dean replied with a smile, running his hand along the smooth hull. Their conversation was easy now, a warm and comfortable current between them. They spoke of David's work, of the tides, of the coming winter. They stood together in the doorway of the workshop, looking out at the distant harbor where the late afternoon sun glittered on the water. Dean took a sip of the warm broth. He thought about how strength, real strength, wasn't just about the power in your muscles. It was in the resilience of your bones, in the wisdom you choose to accept, and in the love that mends your deepest fractures. You know, Dean said, his eyes on the horizon, the tide goes out every single day, but it always comes back in. David put a hand on his father's shoulder, a simple gesture of connection that they had both been missing for far too long. Dean felt not just healed, but whole. Thank you so much for joining us on Arthur's journey. We hope his story has brought you a measure of hope and inspiration. The path to wellness is a personal one, and it's a reminder that sometimes the most profound wisdom is found in the simplest traditions. We're so grateful to have you as part of our community. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next story. Until then, be well, stay strong, and we'll see you again soon.